subscribers as well. Thank you for watching my video. Also, you can catch me on these social media platforms. And if you want to see some great art, hit my DeviantArt page up. And finally, support my Patreon. Thanks. Can't hear me. That should actually be better. Now you guys can hear me. All right, great. Thanks, guys. So, yeah, that's the thing. I'm actually only playing for a little bit. My daughter went to the movies. I was spending some time tweaking some settings, and I wanted to actually get back into Conan just for a little bit, because I think I'm gonna do the dregs today. And while I'm doing the dregs, I'm listening to some Mark Blyth. So we're actually gonna do this. Give it a second. First, I want to actually do one thing. Give me a second, guys. I actually have to set this bot. So I guess it is set. Oh, yeah, it was actually sent to all three. Okay, cool. All right, so let's listen to some Mark Blyth.
The standard thing is I'm really pleased to be here, etc. I'm really pleased to be here for deeply instrumental reasons, which is the following. So Alan was just asking me about what I've been writing, and I talked about one book, but there's another one. I actually got money from Soros.
All right, so Mark Blyth is an economics professor. He's actually really the definition of the word cheeky. Like, this is who he is, and quite frankly, it's fun. And this is the reason why I actually bought his book, Austerity, and we're gonna talk about the financial crash that's coming. Not only the ones that's already came. So let's just go. Already came.
To do something. So I'm looking forward to putting out the following tweet that says, I am fully in the pay of George Soros. Tweet number 2, the pay's not that good. Tweet number 3, certainly not enough to replace you all with minorities. Ooh, was that funny? Was that fun? It's almost funny. Almost. It's just like, it could appeal to different constituencies, that one. You can see how it goes. So the project that I got cash for is called R for Everyone. Now, I'm not the first person to think about this. In fact, there are people here who have thought about this a great deal. And that's kind of why I wanted to come, because I need a primer and all this stuff, and you lot are going to give it to me, which is great. So basically the argument is, as you can probably guess, Piketty's R is greater than G. If the rate of return on G is either low or horribly skewed, why not focus on R? Because R basically has a 6% compounding across different asset classes, so it makes much more sense to give the 80% a 6% real return rather than saying, why don't you save up a bit and stop buying avocados? Because that's just facetious and useless.
All right, so now I know very little about economics. However, I'm only speculating because I've never studied economics. It sounds as if this is what some would consider to be the driving factor in what we see a lot with economics, where people try to invest their money into the most returnable, easiest rate. Sounds fair. Let's see if it has an explanation.
Speaking of facetious and useless, we'll get started. Oh, there's facetious and useless. I mean, really, how on earth did we end up here? That's happening in real time now. He's going to be the Prime Minister of Britain. It's just, what the f***'s going on? And of course, the real puzzle for this one is, you can think what you like about Europe. I'm a reasonable fan of the political project and a horrible critic of the monetary project, and you can have various positions on this. But the problem with Brexit, if you think about it, is it makes no sense because the Brits had the best deal ever.
So this is kind of true. In previous videos, you saw me talk about how in the whole Euro deal, England actually they had the opportunity to keep the pound. They didn't switch to euro like everybody else did, and they were basically the go-between between the euro zone and the U.S. Basically, they were the gatekeeper, and they had all the powers of a gatekeeper. They were basically a financial gatekeeper. But you don't know how to turn a good win into a win. But let's continue.
Right, exactly as it says there. They have this huge financial system that clears euros. Their currency sits as a unique little hedge between the dollar and the euro. They make tons of cash off of this. There are other things I can put in there. They're the largest money launderers in the world through their property markets. They get to veto whatever they didn't want, all the rest of it. You get free market access for 60% of your exports. And you were never going to join the euro, right? That was the key thing. So all the strictures of the fiscal compact and the semester and all that, none of that applied to these guys. So they had the best deal ever, and David Cameron decided to go negotiate a better deal than the best deal ever, and consequently had to have a referendum about it, which then they lost. So, this is sort of really deserves to be explained. This is my favorite little...
So, David Cameron is the one that fucked everything up. And Theresa May still couldn't get the shit right. And now they're going to have that idiot. Oh, God. That's basically the Donald Trump of England. But
Blyth, of course, that was the exit poll at 6 p.m. That was what was meant to happen. That's how badly wrong we were in that case. And this is the take home on this, which is they're not going anywhere. The shitty James...
Alright, so... Sorry, I have to eat something. So... Mark Blyth is one of the only people that predicted Trump's victory as a president. Global Trumpism. Now, he has had criticisms for both right and left politicians. From basically the fiscal policies has been driving both left and right populism. My guy Bernie, even though his populism has actually been around for decades, got a boost because fiscal policy. I'm going to say something real controversial. And people who know me understand why I say it. I believe that there are very few true racists. Not for the whole no true Scotsman fallacy, but there are very few true racists. Like that motherfucking David Duke, he's a racist. Who was the motherfucker got punched? There are racists. Steve Bannon is a little bit. He is racist, but that's only because he's not shit personally, and so he needs somebody to blame, and it's easy for them. But a lot of people are fucking scared. That's a problem that's affecting a lot of people. They're scared. They see their place disappearing, and now they'll vote for anything if they told them you're okay. You don't have to change. It's the bad people that have to change. Not the people at the top, but the people that's below you that's coming to take your place. But let's continue.
James Bond villain at the top is, of course, exactly the Dutch populist, the Le Pen family business, the German elections. Of course, it's interesting now that what I noticed on this one actually when it came out is if you add together the left and the Greens, it's way bigger than the AFD. And the AFD's vote share has actually stalled, and the Greens are now the biggest single party in Germany. So there's an interesting thing here, which is there is a left populism, which we're rather blind to. We just don't want to acknowledge it's the same phenomena. But it's there and it's just as powerful. And of course, this is the Italian elections, and what you've got now is the decline of Five Star and the consolidation of La Lega. But there are lots of other examples. So, very simple. Oh, by the way, don't bother coming on Wednesday because I'm going to be doing the same shit again, right? So if you're getting it now, you're fine. Don't do it twice. So, trying to explain all this to people.
So, like, I'm not going to say he's a one-trick pony, but he's really the fucking old man in the woods that keeps saying the same fucking thing and telling people that shit needs to change quickly, fastly, and in a motherfucking hurry. Like I said, I wouldn't say one trick pony, but he has been consistent with what he's been saying. So that little sly comment is like, really, I'm going to say the same shit until people fucking listen. This is what we need to go by. But let's continue.
With how this happened when you're kind of a global macro person, I came up with this analogy, and it's more than an analogy because one way of thinking about capitalist systems is that they are information processing devices. They are actually computers on a certain level. But I also mean this in a slightly different sense. So if you take this Apple laptop, if somebody had something different than an Apple, in universities it's a monoculture, all you ever have are Apple. Some people have other types of computers. If you drop them on the floor and you let them break into pieces, what you find is that there's all the same components, but they're all arranged slightly differently. So they've all got a motherboard, they've all got a processor, a memory, whatever, etc., etc. And capitalist economies are essentially very similar to this, in that market institutions are ubiquitous but universal, but also very similar. So the Americans have a labor market, it's enormous. It's highly flexible and highly restricted depending on which bit you look at. The German labor market is very, very different. Germans have a capital market, but 50% of their firms don't list on any exchanges. Most of it comes through retained earnings, and there's still very high family ownership of businesses. So these things are different at the level of hardware, even if ultimately what they're doing, the information processing task, is the same. That being said, the way that I think about economic ideas, something that I've written a lot about, is that's the software that runs the system. And an interesting way to think about it is if you have the institutions of Swedish social democracy circa 1970 with Rehn Meidner institutions and wage earners funds, you simply cannot put American libertarian software on top of that and run it, right?
So, basically, what he's actually saying is that, well, for one, when you actually have economies, there are different parts to the economies. There are parts here, parts there. There are different parts to the economy. What he is truly saying is that economies are twofold. the nature of what they are, but they pretty much have the same parts. But the actual, just the people part of the economy, that you can't have the same economy everywhere. You can have similarities, but you can't have the same economy everywhere. And this is why the euro is failing, especially with previous videos we watched up. Well, let's go.
You can't do that. There's an execution error. It's not going to work. So with that in mind, with market institutions of the hardware, economic ideas of the software, how did we get here is a very long story. So I want to talk about three computers on a global macro sense. The one that basically solved the information problem for the period from 1870 to World War I. Why there was no one between basically World War I and World War II. What happens after World War II, version 2.0, and then what happens in the 1980s till 2008, which is a telling date for version 3.0. So the first one's the gold standard. So I've got here policy target. What I really mean by that is, what's the problem to be solved? And the problem to be solved is capital mobility without inflation. The basic problem with the gold standard with open capital accounts and current accounts is you've got a world where for the first time steamships and other technological advances make global trade possible on a scale you haven't seen before. A great example of this is Argentina. Argentina was worthless until about 1870s. When steamships could reach them, the pampas could be opened up to cattle, and then you could slaughter them on site and then basically export them to the core, and the leading families in Argentina made an absolute killing, which retained its structure all the way through the 1930s and eventually brought them Peronism, a form of populism, right? So the problem to be solved there is, if I swap real goods for bits of paper, how do I know that the good bits of paper have anything backing them? Such that you're not just handing me bits of paper, and when I try and buy something else with those bits of paper, it turns out they're just bits of paper. So it needs to be backed by gold. It has to have something there that limits the supply of that currency, because otherwise there's inflation and thus destruction of the value of the currency. Then the mechanism to do this is open capital and current accounts. Basically money flows in, money flows out, and goods and services are exchanged, and the main mechanism of adjustment becomes wages.
All right, so here's the thing. Obviously, the U.S. has moved away from the gold standard because the size of a lot of economies, there's not enough gold in the world. And with having such a concrete we know this value is, it only favors one group. The group that can afford to have the gold. But let's continue.
That is to say, wages inflate or deflate depending on where you are in terms of the trade cycle and the financial cycle. So basically, you all know this, right? Do I need to explain this? Do I need to explain how this works? Yeah? All right. So imagine there's two economies in the world, just two. So you got the Germans, let's say it's the Germans and the Americans. One of them makes Apple computers, one of them makes BMWs. So the Americans decide to go on a tear and buy nothing but BMWs. Well, when they do that, the Germans are exporting exporting goods through the current account. We're importing them. But the correspondence for that is the capital account has to shift out money. And as you pay for that, what's happening is your gold supply goes down. As your gold supply goes down, what happens to the money supply? It contracts. So your money supply contracts at the same time as you're importing more. What's going to happen to wages? They've got to fall to accommodate the money supply. Conversely, the Germans are importing bits of paper. Now, they can use that to buy other stuff, but more importantly, their gold supply is going up, which means that they're basically inflating their money supply, which means there's more money for wages, which means people consume more. When they consume more, what do? They buy Apple computers. So the process reverses itself. So there's what was called the automaticity of the gold standard. Now, in theory, this is great, but the only thing is the mechanism of adjustment is domestic wages and prices. If this happens slowly, then that's fine. But if this happens abruptly and regularly, you get a lot of volatility in the system, which is very disruptive for basically people's lives. So Mark's old line about the sack of potatoes, you can rework it to a sack of potatoes doesn't care what it costs. But a bunch of people who work in an export sector, you're employed, you're unemployed, you're replaced by Irish, you're unemployed. That's high volatility in the system.
So, see, that's the thing about the gold standard. It leading us to the ebbs and flow of, it quite frankly lends itself to the ebbs and flow of just markets. And there are more than two economies. And as he said, if it's done slowly, then no problem, it works. But if it's done too abruptly, well then, my friend, you have a boom and bust cycle. But let's continue.
So governance is a minimalist night watchman state plus extreme violence for the periphery. That is pretty much the governance mechanisms. Now, what does this lead to? Heterogeneous national economies. Argentina does beef, right? Britain does finance and violence. The Germans play catch up, right? Pick who you want to be. Canada does whatever Canada did. I was never sure.
That's fucked up, man.
We call this basically globalization 1.0. It's a profit-led growth model. And what I mean by that is there's no attempt to use fiscal instruments to compensate for the cycle. It's all that the long-run rate of growth is determined basically by supply-side factors through profits for firms. Free trade and free financial flows, flexible labour markets, very low taxes to the extent that they exist at all, very low transfers amongst the population.
So basically, government let business do whatever they want to. You get one nation as one set thing, and most of the money transfers within its own borders. But it's a reach out to get what you need from like different places. However, if somebody starts to act up, the system comes crashing down.
So what's computer 2? Well, it doesn't appear until 45 to 80, and the policy targets full employment. The problem to be solved is employment or unemployment. And why is that? Well, we'll go through why, but when Computer 1.0 crashed, the lesson that was learned was everybody has to get a job all the time, or we're doomed.
All right, so I'm going to actually preview this. I watched a little bit of it, but we know what it is. It was a great fucking depression. It's a fact that when businesses ran amok, they took risky gambles, and they fucked everybody over. Case in point, when you have a system where people can't find a job and people can't keep themselves busy, they started thinking, these motherfuckers in power, they're not looking out for our best interests. Let's start talking about different things, like fucking revolutions. Oh, is that too soon? Now, seeing that we are in the USA, and seeing that we just keep having issues where a certain type of people, maybe Caucasian looking, maybe young males, who have been told that, hey, the world is great, are seeing that the world is not great, and they're effectively being mass shooters or worse, and yet and still we keep having the same fucking issue. But let's continue.
Because that was the lesson of the Great Depression, fascism, and the turn towards communism in Europe. So how do you do this? You restore the world economy with US dollars. The United States in 1945 is 50% of global trade and 60% of global capital. This is, by the way, and I just want to mention this is why the argument the United States needed the periphery, because it needed to make those sales, is really not what was going on. When you're 60% of world finance and 50% of global trade, what other people are doing is irrelevant. They need you to sell them stuff so that they need to be able to sell stuff to you so you can hold dollars. It's the other way around from what we commonly imagine it. So how do you do this? You have open current accounts for trade, so you can basically sell people stuff and then they can buy things from you, and then they can hold dollars. But you close off capital accounts. You do not allow finance to do what it wants. There's no big financial markets, there's no derivatives, there's no currency trades, because again, in the 1920s and 30s, these things were seen to be part of the problem that brought the system down. So you heavily regulate finance. There was a great piece in The Economist magazine in 1947 talking about what Bretton Woods was trying to achieve. And they had a great line that says, what is licensed are things that you can buy, sell, and drop on your foot that lead to jobs and expand welfare. Finance doesn't do that. And that was very much the thinking of the day. And then the governance in this is quasi-cooperative welfare states rather than...
Hold on, guys. Give me a second. I'm sorry.
minimalist night watchman states. Because the way that you create full employment is you force capitalists to invest at home because you can't ship your money abroad. So you get a high rate of domestic investment. When you do that, you can insist that you pay high wages and bargain with big labor. If you're on the other side of that trade as business, how do you manage to sustain that? You have to invest a lot in productivity. Because only if you can pay for those wage increases with productivity do you maintain your profit share. So you get this virtuous circle whereby high demand leads to high wages, which can be paid for by productivity increases, which leads to a high rate of investment, which feeds the whole thing, which only works if you're in a closed economy and you don't let finance play finance games. The result is rather than heterogeneous, homogeneous national economies. The economies of the 40s, 50s, and 60s basically looked the same by and large. They made the same stuff. Everybody made cars. Everybody made their own pharmaceuticals. Everybody had big farming subsidies. The EU was simply the consolidation of that on a sort of a slightly bigger scale. It wasn't heterogeneous specialization in global supply chains, which is what you got, although you never call it that, under.
So here's the thing. This is the shift. When everybody had the job, they said, well, we need to diversify what we do. And with that, you get so many industries popping up. So many industries that would actually be, things like, everybody, like you said, everybody building their own things. And you get these industries that popped up, versus a lot of service industries. It's a lot of manufacturing industry because you built shit at home first. But let's continue.
The first order. Highly restricted financial markets, the domestic correlates of which are COLA contracts, cost of living adjustment contracts, and various forms of corporatism. And what that leads to, as I just said, there is wage-led growth through workers and aggregate demand and fiscal policy rather than through profit-led growth through firms. So very different underlying mechanism for how you get growth in the system. High taxes and transfers, which is part of the steering mechanism for keeping that form of capitalism going. And the construction of local economy cartels. That is to say, French national champions, British Rail, British Telecom, keeping the commanding heights of industry in sort of democratic control, or at least under the control of national capital. Because that was the steering mechanism to make sure that you got these things working reasonably well. A really interesting thing about this period, nobody knows the name of the person who runs the central bank. Nobody knows who McChesney Martin was, right?
So another thing too, this is when you had the utilities that were actual just public utilities, where you didn't have a sell-off of different, you had smaller local utilities where you didn't have these big conglomerates of energy companies or telecommunication companies. You had so much regulations where, yes, in some cases, I will give those libertarian people, like, it strangled growth. Which, not really, because a lot of the fucking innovations that we had were from the biggest socialists, program that we had, called the fucking U.S. military. That's where a lot of our innovations came from. But let's continue.
Right. It's very important. You do, right, but a few people do. But that was not a figure who was important in politics or in the public consciousness. So computer number 3 is the one we grew up with, right? So from 1980 to 2008, the target's price stability. We'll get to why that was in a minute. What was the problem? Controlling inflation and restoring the value of capital. I'll get to that in a minute. The mechanism, maximal global integration and open financial markets. And I'll explain why in a second, just running through this quickly to get to the meat of it. And governance is globalist, welfare state residualist. That is to say, multilateral agreements up to the WTO, out to the EU, down to the Scottish Parliament. Parliaments basically have given up monetary policy. They govern and compete more effectively over less and less governance. So if you think about the Great Moderation period, what did Parliament in the United Kingdom actually do? They sat around tweeting about who was the most outraged about paedophilia. That was pretty much what the role of Parliament was reduced to. What did this look? Again, very much like 1.0. You get this globalization of heterogeneous economies where there's a global division of labour. Open financial markets, flexible labour markets, much lower taxes and transfers, the return of profit-led growth models. It's all about firms making global firms and global profits. The end of local economy protections and cartels. No more national champions, privatization of state assets run down in a public asset book. And a key one is everyone knows the name of the person around the central bank. Because Alan Greenspan became the most important person in the economy. And the person actually nominally in charge of the Treasury, you had no idea what their name was. So I ran through that last one quickly because I'm going to now walk through the mechanisms of each of them. So if you can stay with me on this. There's a little sort of graphic on deflation, why it's a problem, because deflation is basically endemic to a gold standard. If every piece of currency has to have metallic backing, your global rate of growth has to be the rate at which you can go mining. So if you have a technological boom, as there were lots of in the 1870s through the 1910s, then you can't adjust the money supply. So what has to happen is things become more expensive relative to the available money supply, which squeezes wage earners. But it also means that to make more profits, what do you have to do? You have to push down on wages.
So this is a problem of the gold standard. And a lot of people don't want to actually recognize this problem where having that finite currency, if you're not always mining for fucking gold, if you're not trying to strip every last valuable material out of the ground with a growing population, growing demand for wages, it simply can't sustain itself. But let's continue.
So what happens? Follow it through at any particular point. You've got smaller cash flow and profits for companies. That leads to a reduction in production, leads to increased unemployment. That gives less spending on goods and services. You get an oversupply of goods and services relative to market demand. And then you wait for prices to fall. When prices fall, that sends a signal to business not to do new investment because you're making less money than before, and thus it continues. So gold standard arrangements are inherently deflationary. One might add the EMU arrangements are very similar. So again, the wages are the main channel of adjustment. So when you're stuck in a deflationary spiral, the way that you try to retain your profit share, this is Marx, right? Marx was dead on about this, right? You squeeze labor. That's who basically gets the hit on the system. Now, at state level, what do you do? And this is what France specialized in the 1920s, is if there's a fixed supply of gold and trade is collapsing and you don't want your economy to do badly, what do? You try and steal all the gold. So you get gold hoarding, but when you hoard that gold, it's not actually part of the global money supply, so it makes the problem even worse.
So this is one of the things that you don't hear many economists talk about. He quite literally just praised Marx about, when you are always looking for profit and you start to squeeze the fucking people the people who work for you first. It's stupid. And if people don't have a fucking job or can't make ends meet already, you're losing profitability because when you cut the jobs, your neighbor business down the street cuts the jobs. Everybody's cutting jobs who has the fucking money to buy your product. But let's continue.
Then they have World War I, which is rather incompatible with openness in trade, to say the least. And then after the war, you get post-war hyperinflation because you've had all of this pent-up demand that's held back by the war. You have an incredibly unequal distribution of income and wealth. You've not had open capital flows for a while. So the minute the war is over, basically capital is free to exit damaged economies, which crushes the savings that are there, and then those currencies collapse, so you get massive import inflation in all these economies, which is what decimates Eastern Europe in the early 1920s. So the notion that Hitler, something I wrote about in the austerity book, if you take the German narrative that basically inflation brought Hitler to power, the timing's off by about 12 years. It's simply not true. But it's a good story. So what was the second computer's crash? Well, this was inflation. Because the problem with running these little economies that are closed and cut off from the rest of the world, and you're pumping capital and forcing a rate of investment, is when you run full employment for a very long period of time, the median wage has to get bid up. Now that's fine so long as you can do productivity improvements, but what if you get to a point where productivity improvements cannot keep pace with the rate of wage growth demand? Then you get a negative real return on your investment. So if inflation becomes persistent in such a system, you destroy the real return on capital. And what that means is, as Mikhail Kalecki pointed out, is you're going to get a capital strike, because basically capital will stop investing. Because why would I make a bet now, 5 years out, I'm going to get 5% if inflation's already 5%? Inflation might be 7%, in which case I'm -2. I might as well just hoard my cash. So the 1970s is really easily explained by a collapse in investment at a time of full employment and inflation, which of course results in a rise in unemployment at the same time as you have inflation.
All right, great. I actually got fucked.
What that means is that the old regime...
So here's what he just said. Capital got tired of not making money. So they try to go around that by effectively going on strike, not actually giving out, not actually spending money as they should. And effectively, it caused the system to crash because capital isn't invested in their employees, and employees are wanting more and more money. It heads to a crash. And the upper limit is built in by how big your national economy is. And there's always a limit. But let's continue.
This regime that crashes, the one from 45 to 80, was really great for labor, regardless of what we say about the rest of the world, women, minorities, etc. Just in terms of one variable, the wage share. So if you look at GDP as 100, you go to 1945, it's basically 60%, 65% capital, with the residual going to labor. By the time you get to 1973, that's reversed. There's a 12-point gap in the US figures, and it's comparable in the rest of Europe, for basically labor over capital, plus there's inflation in the system. If you're a capitalist, forgive my language, this is a fucking disaster.
Exactly.
Right? You literally can't do capitalism under those conditions. This is when the wage earners funds in Sweden kicks off. Capital's getting very worried. There's mass labor antagonism. There's hundreds of thousands of strikes everywhere. This is the hot red summers. This is the winter of discontent.
Exactly.
Workers get too empowered. And because of that shift in the capital-labor ratio, capital revolts. And that's what we see. So to go back to the computer analogy, there's your hardware reset. Independent central banks. You basically take that bit of the computer and say, no, you don't get to play with that anymore. Because you will always pander to labor. You will increase their wage share because that's where the votes are. But you need us. Now, the whole point of the wage earners funds was, actually, we don't need you. We can do this entirely without you. Which challenges not just the rate of return, but their right to exist. Which is why the politics of this period got very fundamental. So if you think about the birth of neoliberal politics, privatize, integrate, liberalize, globalize, it was certainly about taking the steam out of labor markets, reducing labor's power, attacking trade unions, dismantling labor protections, because that destroys the inflationary forces that hit the real return on capital. But it's also a massive software reset. for a highly reconfigured form of capitalism, which is now going global through supply chains, which is running along the IT revolution, which is letting capital be free for the first time in 60 years so it can find its highest rate of return. And if you do what Paul Volcker did, the chairman of the Federal Reserve back in 1981, he jacks up interest rates to 16%. Well, what does that mean? It means the economy was crushing recession for 18 months. But then what happens is you're liberalizing finance, and there's been a lot of inflation in the system. So two things to think about. If you're a baby boomer, God bless you, and you bought a house in the 1970s with a 5% mortgage over 30 years and inflation went to 15%, the bank just paid half of your house off. It was a brilliant time to be a debtor and a shit time to be a creditor, hence capital's revolt, right? But what happens when Volcker does the shock is that position changes. Inflation falls really rapidly, but you've still got very high interest rates. So this is the era of Wall Street. This is the era of greed is good, because you were getting 7-8% for showing up at Citibank to open up a savings account.
So this is one of the things that baby boomers and the generation directly following the baby boomers doesn't get. The system has been tailor-made. First, they had the tailor-made to them, where they were getting a lot of benefits from the system as it stands. And then that shift, they still had their homes. They still had, the benefits that they already had. And yet, that's not the same for the millennial generation. But let's continue.
In a time when inflation was falling but interest rates were staying high, so finance became unbelievably profitable. And you have a huge pent-up demand for credit because you haven't had access to credit in any meaningful sense for over 30 years. So everybody suddenly wants a credit card. Everybody can get a mortgage. And the greatest trick that banks ever played on us was to call their assets assets, because they're not. They're everybody else's liabilities. So when banks increase their asset footprint, they're actually just lending money to all of us in different forms, hoping that they get some of it back. And the incentive is to run down their capital reserves so that they can lend even more and increase the leverage in the system, which makes the system as a whole fragile. And that was the...
Okay, so I feel I need to define the term leverage that he's using. Leverage is basically how much money that the bank actually owes out. That's what leverage is. But let's continue.
Bug that crashed 2.0. Because basically you end up with a huge amount of debt. Forget government debt, that wasn't a problem. It's private sector debt through leverage in the banking system and a huge build-up in inequality. So the build-up in inequality demands that you borrow more against your future. And that's perfectly reasonable so long as you expect your future to have higher wages than in the past. But what happens if you enter a period of wage stagnation, which you're going to get in this system because there's no way for labour to push on and claim a higher share of national income? Then you're just taking on debts on top of debts. Now, if you're a banker and you know that the wages aren't going to rise, but you've got all those debts out there, which you call assets, which are really liabilities, how do you keep that liquid? You do what Minsky called Ponzi finance. You throw more money after it. So you get to the period in 2004, 2005, when you opened your door and you couldn't come in because there were credit card offers all over the floor, where everybody was treating their house as a HELOC. They were basically using it as a financial asset rather than a place to live. So that system had to crash. These numbers, by the way, if you have a look up there, this is how big bank leverage to GDP got. So Iceland, have you been?
So let's talk about that for a second. And he said it in different points throughout his talks. It got so fucking bad where they quite literally told you to live richly. Citibank actually had that promotion. Live richly. Because they wanted you to they were trying to get as much money as they can off of those bank fees and credit card fees and all that other good shit. And it wasn't trying to get you to save money. Well, let's continue.
into Iceland. It's lovely. It's one town with like 150,000 people in it, and the rest of the country is 150,000 people. They had 8.5 billion in GDP and 10 times that in bank assets. Right? The Brits had 400% in GDP when you add up those numbers. Even the Germans, Deutsche Bank, 86% of GDP in one bank, which on an average Tuesday ran operational leverage of 66 to 1. Which basically meant that a 2% asset cushion for all the stuff they had out there, which meant a 2% turn against their loan book meant they were insolvent and thus would destroy the German state. Right? So what the Allies...
So, if you guys ever remember that scene, It's a Wonderful Life, where this is the explanation of this. If you remember that scene in A Wonderful Life where, you know, George is like, well, your money is in this person's house, your money is in that person's house. The banks ran economies like that for years, for fucking years. And because of that, we had the crash of the 2018. So that wonderful community scene of, whoa, your money is in this house in One Wonderful Life, is quite literally what the banks were doing. Is like, if the system's going down, government give me money, or this person is gone, that person's house is gone, that person's money is gone. That's literally what happened. But let's continue.
Didn't manage in World War II, Deutsche Bank could have pulled off in an average Tuesday. So this is an incredibly tightly coupled, globalized, highly levered financial system. Now, in the 1970s, when it wasn't working for capital, there was a political revolution. There was a system reset, a hardware rewrite, and a hardware modification. This time around, there was no such thing.
No.
Because the hardware mod, sending it to the central banks, what did we do? We said, hey, central bankers, please save us. Now, their whole thing is, we don't do inflation. Their whole thing is, we're the guardians of sound money. But they also are the clients of the financial sector. So when they discovered that the entire thing was going to go down, they used public finances to basically bloat their balance sheet. Those blue lines are basically all the shit on the bank's balance sheets that they were going to go to zero and crush them. And you take it out and you swap it for loans and you cover it up with lots of fancy names and acronyms, but essentially that's liquidity support for the banking sector. Federal Reserve, Euro system through the whole crisis period.
So, now, Mark Blyth is not one of the people that says, well, the system should have crashed and to hell what would have happened. No. He quite understands what would have happened if the system would have crashed. And I don't want a mistake in thinking that he's saying, let the shit burn. Some men want to see the world burn, Mr. Wayne. But, quite literally, what was happening is that we needed a change after 2008, and we didn't get it. You know, we got, everything is fine, and we can hope for the better. And I mean, I'm not gonna lie. At first, when Obama got elected, I was quite pleased. I was fucking happy. But he didn't change shit. He just put a band-aid on a fucking gushing wound and kept the shit going. And that's not okay. And now we have the big fucking orangutan in the motherfucking White House. And he's so stupid. He let the people who crashed the system, quite literally letting in foxes in the fucking hen house. And it's too stupid to actually realize what the fuck is happening. So, let's go.
So there's no system reset. There's no hardware mod this time. And the problem with that is you create a pressure cooker. Because what you've had underlying all this is this lack of wage growth, a huge build-up in private sector debt, a massive amount of fragility, in a system whereby capital has the whip hand and labour has no right and no skill and no bargaining power. Think Anderson's book for the reading that we've had today, right? So this acts as a giant volatility constraint. There's no system reset. And the problem with volatility constraints is eventually the steam has to come out. So there's no new software written, there's none installed, because what we have is incompatible with the reality that we actually live with. This causes a decade-long recession in Southern Europe, massive wage stagnation, continuing wage stagnation in the United States. You rack up very, very high debts into the system. And populists are essentially shitty code writers. They're trying to write new forms of software. Think about all the Bitcoin enthusiasts. What are they trying to do? They know they can't actually mod the hardware, but they can do a hack which writes new software, which allows them to bypass all this bullshit.
So, all right, so just talking about this. This particular point is talking about how shit needed to change massively, and it didn't. We kept that same mindset, that same method of operation after 2008, instead of actually letting a change happen where it would have actually been more beneficial. Where, what am I saying that we should have let the systems crash? Am I saying that, is he saying that we should have let the system crash? No, we should have we should have nationalized at least one or two of those banks and called it a motherfucking day. We should have let them been nationalized, loaded it up with all the bad debt, and would have been the and just wrote it off the balance sheet. But we didn't. We took public sector money to rescue banks and firms that made poor fucking decisions. But let's continue.
So there's a feeling that they know the system's wrong. There's something deeply wrong with our institutions. And we're going to attempt to basically write new codes to get around it. So if you define the problem as immigration, migrants, cultural difference, you write one type of code. If you're a left populist, you write a different type of code. So this is a volatility constraint that produces an angry politics. Let me explain why in more detail.
I'm still waiting for this shit.
Did I do the first one? Did I skip one there? No, I didn't. All right, I'll do this one first. All right. What things cost. So this is basically how markets view inflation. So basically 2%, this is the crisis, 2%, 1%, 2%, just under 2%, 2018. That's nothing, right? It's absolutely nothing. Here's American costs. Everything has gone up by 40% over the more or less period in 2001. Medical care has gone up 80%. Education's gone up 120%. So you basically have a bunch of technocrats telling us there's no inflation in the system, and this is the stuff that people have to buy. That would piss me off too.
All right, so just to address things, this is one of the reasons why Hillary Clinton lost. And ironically, it's going to be one of the same reasons Donald Trump loses. We are spending more. Us wage earners, us people who go to a motherfucking job every fucking day, are spending more for fucking less. Our paychecks haven't increased. We're told to actually survive by carrying more debt. And debt and debt and debt. And when we say something about it, well, you shouldn't be. You are irresponsible because you chose to live by living off of a credit card. Never mind what these motherfucking companies actually do themselves. But because we have to keep up with increasing prices, because we have to keep up with the cost of living going up, but not the cost of living being reflected in our paychecks. We're fucking told it's our fault. Our fucking fault. Because we weren't responsible enough. Fuck you. Fuck you. I say, when it's one individual worker at a job that's causing a problem, then that's the problem of that individual worker. When it's all the fucking workers, then it's a problem of management. And this economy isn't being managed properly. But let's continue.
Here's the second one, productivity versus compensation. Remember I said that second regime ended in the 70s? Boom. All the way in that first regime, what you have is productivity and wages going together exactly as I described. You pay for higher wages with productivity increases, which allows you to cycle back and continue to pay the wages, until basically capital defects because of labour strife and the shift in the profit share, which peaks, as I'll show you in a minute, in 1973. So hourly compensation stagnates, but productivity goes up. That gap is just another way of measuring the inequality gap, because that's the returns to capital, that's the returns to labour. This is the labour share of income in the United States. Peaks, guess when? 1973. A lot of vol going through the 70s, going down, then there's the tech stock bubble from 1997 to 2001, and then it's just systematically down all the way. And what have you got here? You have 58% going from 65%. So that 12, 13 point gap, let's think about what that is. Let's just call it 10%, just for make it the math simple, right? The US economy is $18 trillion. So that's a $1.8 trillion shift. Now, 95% of Americans work for wages. They get W-2s. 5% get the return from capital. So that 1.2, 90% of it has gone to just 5% of the population. And the skew within that is an 80-20 Pareto split. So essentially it really has gone to the 1%, the top 1%. That's another way of measuring that same split between productivity and compensation.
All right, so, and you've heard this millions of times. If you haven't, then I don't know what to say. But worker productivity has actually skyrocketed. Worker productivity has gone through the roof. But worker wages have remained stagnant. And when you adjust for inflation, since the orange orangutan has come up, they've actually gone down. But America was supposed to be great. It was supposed to be great again. Great for who? Even this motherfucking core constituency. The people who are, I would like to say, they're situational racists. Not that they are complete racists or things of that nature. No, it's about what their situation is. They will be racist or cling to a racist ideology because, you know, fuck you, pay me.
You see this in the story on incomes locally. This is the actual real wage gains over the period from 79 to 2016. Unless you're in the top from basically from 60 to 80 or 80 to 100, you got nothing. And negative at the bottom. You've actually lost money in real terms since 1979. And it's been stagnation, 3.41%. It's nothing, right? Even the middle classes, it's gone up 10% in like 30 years. But if you're in the top, you've done very nicely indeed. And globally, we see this, we were talking about this at lunch. Has globalization helped the emerging economies? Absolutely it has. Here's global income. Poorest person in the world, richest person in the world, real income growth over time. And what you see here is China. 80% of this is China, and China coming at the global economy. So very poor economy that does very well over time. But look what happens here, the squeezed bottom. This is the income group from the 60th to the 90th in the global percentile. What have you got there? That's basically the working and middle classes of US and Western Europe. They actually have a decline in real wages because essentially China makes some money. That's it. It's a global redistribution. Well,
so, just get to this point. You know, I saw something that was disappointing to me, to say the least. So something that was hard for me to watch. I saw and I couldn't find a video. If I could have found the standalone video, this would have been something I would have talked about. There was an African American woman in Baltimore saying that Elijah Cummings never helped. Quite frankly, never helped her personally. And it was disheartening because she said that he never made a home he never got me a home. He never made sure food was in my mouth. But he's worried about people at the border. And you can just tell that she was angry because Why do you care about them and not me? And I recognize her anger because, you know, I would be angry too if I felt my representative was taking care of somebody else's problem and not my own. But then I fucking realized that's the same tired shit that you see with these situational racists. Where, why are you worried about these people over here? You're supposed to be taking care of me. And what these fuckers don't realize is a rising tide lifts all boats. And until... And I don't know how many times we have to learn this in history. Because after they finish coming after the people that you think that are less than you, they're going to start coming after you. We have so many examples in recent history. In recent history. But yet and still, you see these people who have this misconception that, well, I'm better than them. Well, crack cocaine and drugs affect African American communities. But us good white folks, nothing is going to happen to us. Heroin, what the fuck is heroin? It's never going to affect us because we're good, moral, upstanding, Christian, and family values. Hey, you got pain? Here's opioids. Now it's a fucking problem. But when we were telling you that shit, that hey, it's affecting us, you thought it was beneath you. Beneath you. And it fucking kills me when I see these people who say, well, it's their problem. Why are we working without the people at the border? Especially African Americans. Especially immigrants. Why should we worry about them? It's their problem. Because eventually it'll be your problem. Let's continue.
Why does that happen? Liberalize, integrate, privatize, globalize. It flows. It's got to happen. And what you see here is, look what's going on here. This is the 99.9, 99.99. It's all gone there. The top 1% captures 27% of total growth. The bottom 50% get 12%. So even though globalization has benefited everyone, it's been massively asymmetric in the benefits. And again, we see this here. I mean, this is the returns just for Canada, the United States, and Western Europe. It's flat until you get basically to the 90th percentile. And then it's exponential when you get to the 99.99. All the money really did go to the top. So how do people keep going when wages aren't growing? Great little slide here. The green line is basically broad money. This tracks GDP growth, right? This is bank assets to GDP. That's exactly the same as the productivity gap because it's its inverse. Because when you're not getting those productivity gains as wages, what are you doing? You're borrowing. That's it. So my favorite advertising campaign from the insanity of the noughties.
Here it goes.
Citibank had an advertising campaign called Live Richly. Let's think about that for a minute, folks, right? This isn't go home and save up and buy yourself a treat. It's just live richly because we will give you a credit funnel because we're in the period of Ponzi finance. We have already lent out
Sorry,
so
guys,
much shit
looking
that
up
we
something.
need to just keep lending to keep the whole thing afloat. That's what was open a cravings account. I mean, come on, seriously? And you see this here. This is Euro area consumer credit between 96 and 2017. Euro GDP growth over that period was rather sclerotic between 1 and 2%. That's a 4% a year compounding. And there's the US on a much longer time scale. Look at credit growth all the way through the first regime. Very, very small. And then the minute that regime ends, boom, that's the returns to finance. That's massive profitability with high real interest rates, and everybody has to borrow because your wages aren't growing. What happens when you bail all this out? Here's the big surprise that nobody wants to talk about in the economics profession. Where though? Because all the inflation. Because you dumped 20% of the global
Sorry,
money
guys, I'm
supply
looking up
into
something.
the global money supply to save the financial system. And there's no inflation anywhere as traditionally measured. Now, you can get into the whole thing about what's the measurement, is it real consumption goods? But here's the thing, healthcare prices in the United States were going up long before they did this. Education prices in the US have nothing to do with global prices and everything to do with the status competition amongst elites. So that's not explained. But the anomaly is you've got very low inflation despite these enormous monetary shocks, right? Milton was wrong. It cannot
Let's
be always
freeze this. Let's freeze this for a second. I'm just looking up some information for this arrow. Damage 15. I'm just trying to figure out which arrow works well for me. Because I want to get some arrows because I'm facing this fucker. Okay, so I don't think I can get any ivory. Shit. Let's see if a steel arrow will work. No, see, no. Alright, I'm sorry guys, I'm just looking up something. Looking up. Alright, sorry. Okay, let's go. Let's go back. Alright. Sorry about that.
And it wasn't. Kalecki was right. It was about labour. And once labour loses its ability to push on its demands in the form of higher wages against the capital share, why would you have inflation? Plus, you've globalised the pool of capital. How do you crowd out the globe? By definition, it's impossible. And then the other one is the austerity push. This is just hilarious. The funny one is, we've got to stop government spending. They're spending like drunken sailors. Really? Let's have a look. So here's the Americans between 1995 and 2000. It's going down. Funny that. And then it goes up from 2000 to 2004. What was that all about? Oh, I don't know, 9/11 in Iraq. Right? Totally voluntary. Does anyone remember what happens around 2007 when they bailed the global financial system? It all ends up on the global balance sheet, on the federal balance sheet. Because what you're doing is you're taking private sector debt and supporting it with the public sector purse, and ultimately that shows up on the public sector balance sheet. So this is George Osborne saying we've been spending too much, blah, blah, blah. You're spending too much. You're bailing out the assets of the top 1%. That's what you were doing. And that's where it shows up, in massive public debt. Now, I don't worry about public debt because at the end of the day, so long as you have the intergenerational capacity tax and then you grow in real terms, particularly if inflation's low, if inflation's higher than the rate of growth, it defeats itself. But we don't live in that world because we're losing our intergenerational capacity tax because we don't like immigrants and we haven't had enough kids of our own. So that's a big problem going forward. In Europe, the kids that we did have about 20 years ago grew up in a 10-year-long recession, which means that their lifetime income is now massively shocked and will never recover to what it could be. So their ability to pay taxes to service that debt has actually become compromised, right? So there's a problem with debt, but we engineered it, and it's not because we overspent, it's because we bailed out the top.
Yes.
So what happens when you get into this world? Well, you stagger into a world where the old rules don't apply. Labour can't push up wages even at full employment, which is where we are now. Jobs can be moved abroad or automated, which has been true for the whole global period. And the sort of the trumpet response of economic nationalism is very much an attempt to curtail that. Unions are absent or powerless to do anything about this, and immigrant labour gets politicised. Now, here's the other story, though. We don't notice this, but it's also true in product markets. It's not just labour markets. Capital got the short end of the stick as well. So if you think about this, you know, everybody's got one of these things, right? This is a supercomputer. The price of this in real terms in comparison to what it was 10 years ago is nothing. There's not just ruthless deflation in labour markets, there's ruthless deflation in product markets. This stuff is cheap as chips in comparison to what it was and how much it would cost.
Exactly.
So you've had incredible competitive dynamics in most sectors. And globalization has augmented that by making margins razor thin. So the only way the companies make money in this game is, guess what? Volume. You've got to keep playing that game, otherwise you get crushed. What that means is the incentive is to do anything except push up prices on the capital side. And product markets have seen this ruthless deflation for 25 years. And then...
So, and I'm actually may leave it pretty soon. Our movie should be over soon. But with this whole thing of the greed, a lot of capital has actually screwed themselves, because here's the thing. Yes, the iPhone and all this other good shit were made by public financing, but what happened is they tried to make it so cheap to be profitable, they made it too cheap for them to actually be profitable. Think about it. How much do things cost? I used to have a cell phone. My cell phone used to be fucking expensive to replace. Now, because they have to just keep going and getting everything out, because they had to have a PlayStation 4, and the PlayStation 4, they had too many of people buying it. They had to make a PlayStation 4 Plus. Quite literally, companies are mass producing themselves to a smaller and smaller margin.
You burn all this by having shareholder ideology and short-term valuations, which means that even if you do want to do longer investment or raise wages, if you do, some activist shareholder will jump on the board with 2% of the shares, fire the whole C-suite, and you're back to square one. Who's this? Dennett. I think it's creepy when people have the same look as their idol. It's like David Harvey with Marx. It's just, you shouldn't be allowed to do that. It's very weird. Dennett called evolution Darwin's universal asset. I think that was the claim. That essentially the minute you start thinking in evolutionary terms, you see it everywhere, and suddenly you can have an evolutionary explanation of everything, whether it's warranted or not. I think neoliberalism is a universal asset. First of all, it attacks the source of inflation. It eats through the profit cartels coming from labour in the 1970s and 80s. But then it goes through product markets, because once you've integrated, privatised, marketised the whole thing, then your ability to hold margins against global competition, that gets absolutely shut down as well. So what's the consequence of this? It turns on the political system. Because the political systems that we've known since the 1950s have survived both this big regime shift. It's the same Labour Party, the same Tory Party, the same Democrats, etc. But the things that they were put there to guard ended 30 years ago. And they've basically been living like everyone else in this hyper-connected, credit-fueled bubble, which burst in 2008, which we should have let die because that was the system reset, and we didn't, and we bailed it out and created a massive volatility constraint. You haven't addressed any of the underlying problems to do with inequality, lack of wage growth, indebtedness, etc., etc. And what are you doing? You're just holding it down and going, trust us, we're the experts. Oh, really? You didn't get any of that right. Why should I trust the damn word that you've got now?
Exactly.
And that's why politics is not just in trouble, has structurally shifted. If you look at political systems across Europe in particular, they're gone. There is no such thing as a French party system anymore. Like, Macron's really interesting. He's a centrist populist. Right? He's a very odd character, right? Jeremy Corbyn is basically a leveraged buyout for the dead husk of New Labour. He's a left populist. The Tories are about to split themselves over Brexit. Spain now finally has a right-wing party, finally. The Italian party system's completely gone. Right? And we have Trump. So they're all gone. Labour markets, product markets, political markets. So what happens next? Well, there's a kind of depressing story, which I don't really believe is true, but I'll run through it. Growth becomes critically dependent on returns to finance. Finance is constrained by structurally low interest rates. Debt reduction is constrained by low inflation, but your debts can be rolled over. That's the good thing. You keep liquid because nobody wants to crash the system again. Sustained wage growth fails to materialise. Ever higher level of inequality and sharper urban-rural divides appear. Skill bias in labour markets accentuates, and the take-home is the build regime becomes politically unsustainable. Centre parties fail. Neo-nationalism becomes structural. Now, on one reading, and this is, I think this is true, get used to the new normal. Populism is a feature, not a bug. And it's basically debts are too high, wages are too low to pay off the debt, and inflation's too low to eat the debt. If you're on the left, you basically blame capital and globalisation. If you're on the right, you basically blame immigrants and globalisation. As they say in Scotland, same shit, different smell. So to go back to the very beginning, how did we get here and why? The technical version of this is what's called either macroeconomic regimes or growth models. And I'm involved with a project with Lucio Baccaro and Jonas Pontus to sort of pull all this together. And basically the way we see these things is not as computers, but basically as what we call macroeconomic regimes, into which are embedded lots of local growth models. So if you think, for example, of the Germans, what do the Germans do? They export. That's the bit of GDP they tickle to get growth, right? What does France do? It stimulates public consumption. What do the Brits do? They do finance. We're back to a highly specialised world in which GDP growth is dependent on what everybody else does, but it's become so specialised it's fragile, and finance plays a huge part in liquidating the whole system. So each is a
they actually made me finish, and I can replace this. Yay!
Exposed in moments of crisis, and this is nothing new. World War I showed the insustainability of a deflationary gold standard. Right? The 1970s inflation showed that the Bretton Woods system basically had to end. And the 2000 financial crisis was another of those moments, but we build the system. And what we tend to do overall is move from regimes with deflationary biases that benefit capital and creditors to inflationary regimes, and I might add nationalist regimes rather than internationalist regimes, that benefit workers and debtors and back again. And we're in an interregnum between the two types. And that's basically where we are. Now, here's why I'm hopeful, and I don't think the depressing story is true. And it's because climate change changes the game completely. So there's certain things I can price in, and I can price in inflation, interest.
All right, so this is actually interesting, and it kind of reminds me of, like, his fucking idea is, like, I've been thinking about climate change a lot recently, and I believe it's true. I believe we're the cause of it, and we're accelerating it, and we don't give a fuck. But if you ever played the game Horizon Zero Dawn and listened to the overall story of Horizon Zero Dawn, that shit is coming to a head. And it's not fucking fun. You know, outside of the self-replicating, biomass-converting robots that can be autonomous and, you know, yeah, hopefully we don't get a Ted Pharaoh. But let's continue.
Rates will stay incredibly low forever. So if you're buying a mortgage in the next, 10 years, right? Oh, you better buy it now because interest rates might go up. That's never going to happen, right? Forget about it. You've also got structurally low inflation. It's just not going to go anywhere. Price of stuff is a different thing. Happy to talk about the distinction between the two, but as a general level, price is not going anywhere. Now, why does this change the game completely? Well, let's think about this. Number one, you know that in 10 to 15 years' time, you're going to start to see severe effects. Miami might lose drinking water, right? That's when, as I said earlier today, America shits itself, right? And what you then get, because the old party systems are dead, is you get a shift from a kind of right populism and denial to a kind of Green New Deal populism. And you see this particularly in Europe with the rise of the Greens, the repopulation of the far left rather than the official left. That's where the political action is there. So the question is, can Green New Deal projects deliver fast enough to disable the populist right and the right-wing right? And the answer is probably not, but they have absolutely no answers. Because at the end of the day, those climate change effects are going to be more and more seen. Eventually, the oil companies are going to have to do a mea culpa and explain that climate change denial was entirely them and they paid for the whole fucking thing, which is massive on a legitimacy scale. So there's lots of structural stuff coming down that simply says that the right project has to collapse. Now, on a sort of liberty or libertarian viewpoint, I mean, this is terrible. This is massive state encroachment on a scale that we'll never have seen before. It's the libertarian nightmare, right? But the alternative is you're dead, because there is no individual solution to this. But there's an upside to nationalism, perhaps in a perverse way. So is going back to national economies and inflation economies bad for climate change adaptation? I don't think so. Right. So here's the problem. The 1990s and 2000s was all about global governance. So we can have Paris Accord and Paris Agreement.
All right. So here's the thing, and this is actually, it sounds like he's saying two different things, but when you are forced to, he's saying that we're going to go back to more of a national economy, which probably is true. But what he's actually saying too is those national economies are going to have to work together with other national economies. Now it's kind of a globalist kind of national thing where I'm gonna take care of my shit, because if I don't, the whole system will collapse. But I'm gonna really take care of my shit. But let's continue.
Paris. Everyone goes to Copenhagen and has canapes and drinks champagne and signs an agreement, goes home and does nothing. Right? Whereas you've got China, the food supply is compromised. They know they don't want to be dependent on oil imports because they don't have much. They know that coal is killing them. In 2016, China installed more fourth generation solar than the United States has in total solar capacity in 1 year. So all I need to move the needle on this is I need the United States to flip to left populist, and I need China to continue to be China. And Europe's already doing this. And if you add those three spaces together, that's 80% of global consumption. That's what you need, just three. I don't need the agreement of 1,000 German princes. So in a way, this upside to this is actually kind of good. Global governance is not better for climate change because it encourages free riding. Everybody waits for everybody else to do it. Mm-hmm. National experiments are interesting. I like the way that China does a lot of its public policy making. So the idea is they're this terrible totalitarian state with brainwashing and control and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, they also have the highest rate of fiscal decentralization in the world.
No.
So around 80 cents on every dollar spent locally. Now you have to remember, when you're talking about spending locally in China, you're talking about spending in something the size of Copenhagen. But that's local expenditure. But nonetheless, what the government does is if they have, let's say, a project, we want to do something about rural poverty, they'll basically send instructions out. Basically, that's what we want to do. We'll give you some cash, figure it out. So you've got 120 different districts. And some of them will steal the money, and some of them will lie, and some of them will fail. But 4 of them will actually come up with something that looks pretty interesting. And they'll go, what did you do? And then they'll send teams around and they'll figure it out, and they'll go, right, everybody who's like them do this. And that's when the authority comes in, and that's when you get massive changes. Industrial upgrading in China, the whole China 2020, this comes from basically the analysis of what were called the second-tier industrial areas that didn't have the first big wave of foreign investment.
All right, guys, I'm gotta go off for the night. For right now, I may hop on a little bit later on tonight. Thank everybody who's watched, and freaking enjoy. Have a great time, and see you later.